thank you very much, and it's always a joy to share with fellow soldiers in the battle, and I'm very honored to be able to do that today, and I appreciate the passion that Gary has for all these years for ministry, and so I have so many friends here this morning, and appreciate it so much. You know, after spending 40 years in an organization, and still have a lot of dear friends in that organization today. But, you know, there is life after whatever organization you may have been associated with previously in whatever capacity. But I've been a part of the fellowship now almost 30 years. And in the early days, I was still a member of that other organization, and one night the bishop called me and he said, David, I was surfing the internet tonight and I came upon your name. You're the World Missions Director for this work. I said, Larry, you weren't surfing anything. Somebody told you something and you went and found me. But I said, it's a fellowship. It's not an ordaining organization. And, you know, so I had some mud puddles I had to avoid there for a while. But I just thank God for the leadership of the fellowship. You know, I can remember some pretty tough days when the organization was struggling with some issues. And today I really believe, as Brother Harry said last night, to me, it's one of the finest organizations because there's no competition. There's no, you know, having to come in with some kind of resume and some kind of report to wow someone. No, it's just a group of people that love God and love each other and are on a mission together. And it's an honor to be able to be a part of it and to be able to serve. Well, Gene Evans, when he was president, asked me if I would develop this, what has been now called the E41 ministry. And there's a QR code on a couple of them on that card. When you get a chance, if you'd like to, you can go there, and one goes to my website, the other goes to the fellowship's E41 website. There are a lot of great interviews on there with people, and we actually did a number of interviews when I was here with Pastor Harry in January, I think it was. And one of the things that I've shared, Brother Harry, since those 4 days as I've traveled is we stood together right here on Wednesday night after it was over, and I'll never forget how he closed that service. He said, we're no longer a church with 6 full-time ministers. We are now a church of 306 full-time ministers. And he says, I'm commissioning 300 of you tomorrow to go to the marketplace. Amen. And the other 6 of us are going to show up here and try to figure out how we can help you become successful in the call that God has called you to. And so this morning, I want to give you another word. Gary gave us momentum last night, and the word that I want to center my thoughts around this morning is the word leverage. Leverage. And here's one definition that I found that I think will fit really well. Leverage is the ability to influence a system or an environment in a way that multiplies the outcome of one's efforts without a corresponding increase in the consumption of resources. In other words, leverage is the advantageous condition of having a relatively small amount of cost yield a relatively high level of return. And so what I want to share with you this morning is how, as church leaders, to leverage what God has gifted you with through the marketplace ministers that sit before you once or 2 or 3 times a week, and those that God calls you to touch throughout the week. Now let me give you a biblical foundation for this. Many will believe that the mission of the church was given in Matthew 28 as Jesus was about to return to heaven. But the real mission of the church started much earlier than that. In Genesis, when God was giving Abraham his blessing, stars of the air, the sand of the seashore, one of the things he said in there, you will possess the gates of your enemy. Amen. A chapter or 2 later, as the next generation is now ready to take over, Isaac had sent his servant to find a wife. And in Genesis 24, verse 60, as Rebekah now is getting ready to leave her family and go to be the wife of Isaac, they said to her in that verse, may your children be thousands of tens of thousands, and may they possess the gates of their enemy. Amen. You see, the church does not have a mission. The mission has a church. Glory. We need to realize that we didn't become a church and then God give us a mission. No, God gave a mission to those that He called, starting with Abraham. And then He just through the years and generations gave that mission to the church. And so the mission has a church, and we're on a mission. Part of that mission is in Matthew 28, yes. Go into all the world and preach the gospel. Make disciples of all nations. My book back on the table, and I was going to mention this as I started, but I have a number of things back there. I want to sow something into all of you. So you go back there, you take a book or a CD, it's free. Take it with you today, whatever you'd like to have. Anything else you'd like to have, if you want to leave a donation, it will help us finish our medical clinic in Nairobi. But I want to sow into you today, so take whatever will be a blessing to you. But when that book, Idle in the Marketplace, came to me, was after I had sold my part as the owner of an RV dealership in 2005. And I was sitting in my study, and I said, Lord, what do you want me to do? I said, they called me pastor for 40 years. I was probably the worst pastor that ever tried to pastor, because I was not a shepherd. And I was frustrated because I was trying to be a good pastor, but I wasn't energized by shepherding. And God says, I never called you to be a shepherd. I called you to be an apostolic leader. And if you notice where I've sent you, you've always had something to deal with, something that needed straightened up, whatever. You know, one of my grandkids a few weeks ago, you know how they do on Facebook. If you were an animal, Pappy, what animal would you be? And I said, well, let me think about that for a minute. And so it came to me. I said, I'd probably be a salmon, because I'm always swimming against the current. And this whole E41 ministry has not been shouted from the rooftops by the church crowd, I can tell you. But it's been celebrated by the other group of ministers in Ephesians 4, and I'm going to share them with you. There are some in the church world that are now realizing, yes, we do have an assignment. But he said in Matthew 20, verse 6, why do you stand idle all day in the wilderness, in the marketplace? I'd read that many times, but that day it just jumped off the page. You know what their excuse was? Anybody? What did they say when he asked them? No one will hire us. You see, the church is in the marketplace. We don't have to go evangelize. We don't have to go witnessing. We're already going. We're already there. Your people are there every day. The question is are they fulfilling the biblical mandate of why God has called them there? Ephesians 4 was where he took me next. And I read in Ephesians 4, verse 1. Paul makes a shift in verse 1. In Ephesians, he goes from laying that theology and the doctrinal foundation to now he says, I urge you to walk worthy in the vocation wherein you are called. The word vocation in the King James is better translated calling. Walk worthy in the calling wherein you are called. That's where all of us began. A few verses later, he has a secondary calling. He calls some out of that verse 1 crowd, and he says, and he gave some to be apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, and evangelists. He said, I'm calling you for the rest of your life to help build a bridge between those that are called in Ephesians 4:1 and those that I've called to train and equip them in Ephesians 4:11-16. He said there's no such thing as a secular job for a Christian. A Christian can't have a secular job. Not if you understand the priesthood of all believers. I said, Lord, how do you disciple a nation? I said, the church that I grew up in, and I went to church 9 months before I was ever born. I was raised in a Pentecostal preacher's home. And so I went to church. Grandfathers of both sides of my family. I said, they've struggled making disciples one-on-one. How do you disciple an entire nation? He said, go back and read Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but read it now from a discipleship point of view. So I did. This conversation that day was 6-7 hours. He said, Israel came out of Egypt. They thought their destiny was to get to the promised land, but it wasn't. They confused their destination with their destiny. He said their destiny was not the promised land. That was their destination from which their destiny was to be fulfilled. He said, I wanted all of Israel to be a kingdom of priests. Exodus 19, verse 6. You shall be for me a kingdom of priests. Well, Israel didn't want to be. You know, he told Moses, he said, tell them to show up at the mountain because I want to come and talk with them the way I've talked with you. I get amused every once in a while when I hear people say, oh, God, show up here today. You better be ready. It better be more than just an offhand invitation. Because if God would show up here in just a little bit, we couldn't stand on our feet. We'd be on our face before God. So they came. He said, don't rush the mountain. Don't touch it or you'll die. So God began to come. And when God began to show up, the mountains began to shake. Lightning, all of nature announced his arrival. Well, they got afraid. They ran on their way by Moses. They said, tell us what he wants. We're out of here. I'm afraid in the church world, in too many occasions, it hasn't changed. Pastor, tell us what God's telling you. Because we don't have time to really get to the mountain this week. We're busy. Got a lot going on. I really believe if our marketplace people really understand who they are, amen, and their calling, amen, and the power of God that lives within them, amen, they'll beat a path to the door of your office, your life, your church services, if they understand that you're there for them. Amen. They're not there for you. You're there for them because you've been called to equip them for their ministry, to go into their world and change the culture of their world. You see, I believe, Brother Gary said last night, too much of the church since Constantine took over 1700 years ago changed that early church from what they were for 300 plus years to what much of the church has become. And we're suffering from what is called institutional ego. We want a place at the table of society, but we've lost our saltiness. We've lost our light. I mean, how many lights does a lighting store need? We don't need to come in and impress each other with our light. Have you seen my light lately? No, I can't see. Get it out of my eyes. How many have heard of Richard Halverson? Chaplain of the U.S. Senate from 1981 to 1992. He was pastor of the Great Presbyterian Church in North Hollywood, California for many years. He was sitting in his dentist chair. The dentist went to his church. And he's sitting in the dentist chair with his mouth all propped open. And the doctor said, Pastor, I've just been asked to be chairman of the board of the Englewood School District. But if I accept it, I'm going to have to pretty well give up all I'm doing at the building to be able to do that. Richard said, I began to rise up with anger. He said, but I couldn't say anything because my mouth's all propped open. And he said, I'm glad it was because God began to deal with me. He said, my first thought was, how dare you make something else a priority over the organization? Don't you know how vital you are to what I'm doing and what we're trying to accomplish? And, you know, he had about a half hour, 40 minutes to have this mental conversation with God. He said, God told me, he said, the church has succeeded in pulling people, their people, out of the world, out of society, out of the culture. And he says, you complain about all the godless organizations today that are run by the heathen, that the world has no more time for the church. But he says, I'm afraid the church has very little time for society. He said, that man's not wanting to go serve on the school board in a very influential position for any other reason than you've made him a great disciple of me. You've developed him with a calling that now the world They don't understand it, but they see something in him that they feel he could help them with. He said, don't complain about society until you send your marketplace ministers back into the calling that I gave them. I called him there. He said, I'm afraid that your church has become an island of piety surrounded by an ocean of need. He said, I'm afraid that North Hollywood Church has become a place surrounded by orbits, people orbiting around the programs and all the structure that you have developed. And then he said, he really got me. He said, if the truth be known, Richard, there are a system of orbiting satellites around you, and that's what you're bothered about. He said, about that time, I repented, and the dentist finished where I was able to speak. He said, Jimmy, I think that would be a wonderful calling. How can I help you do that? And it wasn't but a few years till he was asked to come to Washington, D.C. and become the chaplain of the U.S. Senate. And then he finished his career pastoring Fourth Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. Friends, my heart aches as I see the church getting kicked to the curb. I'm in meeting after meeting. I'm on the road 250 days a year. For the last 10 years, I've spent almost 8 years away from home. Why do I do it? Because the call, the mission. I could retire, whatever that is. If nothing else, the actuary tables say the average man who retires with nothing to do dies within 7 years. Perfectly healthy, but he dies. Why? He's not worth anything anymore. The wife, when he retires, she now has a full-time husband. Find something to do. People say, how? Maria and I will be married 47 years this Sunday. And people say, how have you been able to stay married 47 years? I said, one secret. Every once in a while, when I've been home too long, she'll say, don't you have a trip somewhere? She was with me we were away 12 of the first 14 weeks of this year, and she said, I got to stay home. So I go, you go, we go, because of the call. But God told me that day, He said there's 3 entities that control every nation. He said they are the business community, the business people, God who has gifted them, according to Genesis, to create wealth. God put the wealth in the earth. He's not adding to it, but He wants to get it to the church.
Yes, sir.
And He said, the marketplace people have it all because I've gifted them. Money is never a problem. He said, I brought Israel out of Egypt, loaded with the wealth of Egypt. In fact, if you read the text, they went house to house before they left asking for it. Hey, we're taking a trip. Come on. And the Egyptians didn't know why. They just gave it to them. Money is not your problem. According to Ecclesiastes 10:19, money is your answer. Now, Ecclesiastes is written by a backslidden king, but it's still made the canon of Scripture. The forefathers, we need to include this. It says, money answereth all things. When I served 8 years as World Missions Director, I heard from missionary after missionary, national after national, when I asked them, what's your biggest problem? What's your biggest need? Money. If I just had more money, I said, money's not your problem. Now I'd share with them Ecclesiastes 10:19. Money's your answer. Now the reason you don't have it is because you do have a problem. Let's figure out what it is, get it fixed, and then God will give you. He said He'll give you pressed down, shaken together, and running over shall men give to you. Glory. But if you come asking for it, I was shocked of how many missionaries and nationals do not tithe. I am a mission. I said, yes, and I broke one right now. See, the world says no project goes under for lack of financing. You just don't ask enough people. And we have taken that same philosophy and brought it right into the church. If I can just get to enough wealthy people, why don't you get to the one who gave them their wealth? He walks with me and He talks with me and He tells me I am His own. He's your source. But if you're going to keep Him locked up because you're a thief, now you can be a born-again thief. People say, thieves going to heaven? Probably. Oh, that's so strong. I didn't write the book. I mean, it didn't make the list in Revelation, with those that will not. But you hurt yourself. Oh, my people have nothing. They have absolutely nothing. I said, yes, they do. Because if they had absolutely nothing, they would die. Well, they just have a little handful of rice. I said, have you taught them to put it on the table and make 10 little piles out of it? And then say, Pastor, the Bible says I'm to help you as you feed me the Word of God. And you give one. Oh, I could never do that. I could never take. I said, you're keeping them locked up in poverty. See, the business people will teach you those kinds of things. They create the wealth. The government wants it. Educational institutions want, everybody wants it. And then here you come as a church leader, standing in line. I love what you said last night. If you introduce them to God and you keep them focused on Him, you won't have to preach on tithing other than as a discipleship topic. This is what the Word of God teaches you. I teach you giving because it will help you. If you get into the bondage of the bucket, whether it's as a church leader or any ministry, that's bondage. Dig deep. Get the biggest bill you have in your wallet. I was in a service one night with Marie years ago. There was an evangelist from Orange, Texas. I'll never forget. He said, I want you to reach into your wallet and get the biggest bill you have tonight and put it in the offering. I leaned over to Marie. I said, I wish I had my mortgage bill here tonight. It's the biggest one I've got. No. Money is not our problem. Because God owns it all. Hallelujah. He just wants to give it to us. Hallelujah. He said the government is the second entity that controls every nation. They pass the laws and regulations that control that nation. Ask any business owner, who's your biggest headache? The government. The rules and regulations are strangling the businessmen. Capitalism is not wrong. It's capitalism without morals is the killer. The Bible does not teach socialism. If it teaches anything, it teaches reward for hard work, preparation, and give to God first. That's what the Bible teaches. The third entity is the educational institutions, really starting at the university level, because they are the ones that determine the values and philosophies of every generation. What's wrong in America, in the West in general, and much of the world is the church is absent from those three entities as far as being a force for the kingdom. We're there. He said the philosophy that the business community and the government people, their values and their philosophy is what is destroying America. Where did they get it? They got it when they went to the universities. That the top universities in America, such as Harvard, Yale, Brown, Cornell, all the Ivy League schools, who set the bar for the educational community, who started out as training centers for ministers of the gospel. John Harvard, if you read the history of Harvard, he not only wanted to train church leaders, he wanted to train marketplace leaders and used that word. But see what happened. The leadership component got pushed aside by the managers. And it happens every generation. When the leadership component is pushed aside and the managing component now has center stage, you're in trouble. That's why pastor, by definition, is a managing gift. Let's not talk about titles. Let's talk about gifting. It's a managing gift. You don't grow anything with a pastoral gift. You grow it with an apostolic gift who creates the opportunity for the other four gifts to flow, and that's in another book that I'll have finished this summer called The Abominable Snowman, God's Gift of Leadership. And I'm going to compare the Ephesians 4 fivefold gift ministry with Aaron and his sons, who were the forerunners of the fivefold ministry in the Old Testament. And the Old Testament tabernacle has all five gifts. The apostolic gift, not because it's better, but because it's first, according to 1 Corinthians 12. He's set first in the church, apostles, prophets, teachers. The title pastor didn't even make the list there. It's included in with helps or governments. You see, if you truly have an apostolic gift, you reside in the holiest of holies. You're like the abominable snowman. You're rarely seen, but your footprints are everywhere. Most of the top Fortune 500 businesses are being led today by people who are known to be introverts. They're not the Donald Trump type people. They are people who influence everything and make it happen. And so when that got pushed out of the university system, that's when stuff like the Humanist Manifesto, written in 1933, crept in and began to take over the educational institutions of America. That paved the way for all the other dominoes that are now beginning to fall. The greatest threat to Christianity is not secular humanism anymore. It's not ISIS. It's the LGBT agenda. If you've never read the book, you need to get it. It's called The Overhauling of Straight America. Written in the late 80s. They have 6 phases. They are at now phase 5. How did 2 to 3% of the population in America get to where they are? Because they knew where to start. They knew, it is chilling to read the excerpts that you just Google, The Overhauling of Straight America. If you want to buy the book, it's on Amazon, but it's now up to $65, $70. They don't want it out. So they thought they'd price it out of range. How do we disciple a nation? The Lord said, you've got to flood those 3 entities. I said, Lord, you gave that revelation to Loren Cunningham 40 years ago, called the 7 Mountains. And he gave it to Bill Bright, who took it worldwide. He said, no, I'm not talking about 7 mountains that need to be conquered. He said, I'm talking about 3 entities that need to be invaded. Allow my favor to elevate them up through till they get to a place where they make the decisions. He said, the pattern is already in Scripture. He said, you know the story of Joseph, Daniel, Esther, Nehemiah, on and on it goes. You don't have apostles like the first century church sitting in your pews or your seats, but you do have those kinds of people. I call them the Nehemiah people. You know the story. Haggai had gone as the prophet and prophesied about the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Ezra, the book before Nehemiah, took a remnant and went up and got bogged down in the mud trying to rebuild the temple. God says, I've got to get somebody else on the team up there. It's going to take too long if I don't. So he tapped a young apostolic marketplace minister who was serving in the court of King Artaxerxes. And he said, you're the man. You're the man. You're the man. He had a 4-month prayer meeting after he got the report from his brothers of the disaster in Jerusalem. And Nehemiah came out of that 4-month prayer meeting in chapter 2. And he said, I need a couple things. I need a couple letters. I need one from you, King, giving me the authority to go through all these enemy nations till I get back there. And I need one to Asaph, the keeper of the king's force. I need some material. You see, God's going to give you the power and He's going to give you the provision every time that He gives you an assignment. Amen. Every time. Now, He's the slowest person I know to always be on time. See, on time for Him is not according to the clock or calendar. It's according to seasons and times. And you may be in a season that you wish would end and the next season would start. But God knows how to do the seasons and times. He said, no, they're not mountains. He said, they're entities. He said, tell the church leaders. Not everybody in their pews are sheep. We're all sheep as we relate to God. And probably 80 to 90% of the people in your pews are sheep. They work for somebody else. And you want to teach them how to be a good sheep. I mean, you need lots of helpers. You need lots of people that, when it's time to move the piano, they don't grab the bench. They really get underneath the load and they help you. But he said there are some in your pews that are lions and eagles, that you try to treat them like a sheep, you're going to have trouble. He said, I want you to build the bridge of relationship between the two groups of ministers in Ephesians 4. Quit calling them lay people. He said, where'd you get that term? You know where it came from? It started under Constantine. It comes from the Laodiceans, the laity. You see, Constantine, when he became emperor of Rome, set the model that much of the church today follows. He said, if I'm going to get control of this church, I've got to get rid of the apostles and prophets, because those two gifts, those two men, those two groups of people, they have been driving this. We thought we had them rounded up 300 years ago and slaughtered them all. But here they are again. He did not do the church a favor when he joined and legalized Christianity. All he did was put it under the Roman Empire. And we've been a slave to the state ever since. You can be a church still in America without being a 501c3. You don't have to have a 501c3. No, I'm not saying not to. I'm just saying you don't have to yet. May come a time when you do. But you don't have to. Our forefathers thought of that. God said no. Encourage the church leaders to leverage their people and not just lead them, or worse yet, drive them, or try to make them good church members. This is not about making them good church members. It's about making them marketplace warriors. I mean, why would he write Ephesians 6 if he just wanted them? Well, second thought, I can understand Ephesians 6 because I've seen some of the greatest battles between people I ever saw was in the church. No, he wrote Ephesians 6. If you've never read Rick Renner's book on Dress to Kill, it is a great treatise on Ephesians 6. We need to teach our people how to go to the marketplace and not start lopping off heads through physical manifestations and anger and all that. No, teach your people how, when they get out of their car or off of the bus or how they get to their place and their assignment, is to take control in the spirit world immediately every day. Every time I get out of my car, whether I walk into Walmart or whether I walk into a business or wherever it is, I say, devil, you've had this place long enough. It's mine now. I've arrived. You're finished. You can go hide in the corner. But you're not going to be in control of what's going to happen here in the spirit world any longer, because greater is he that's in me than he that's in the world and roams the earth. See, that's what your people want to hear. That's what they need to hear. And if you keep them tied up coming to the building for the club meetings all the time, they'll never have time to be a force where God has called them to be. That's my heart. That's my message. That's what I travel. I want you to be more successful in what God has called you to do. Well, how do you create leverage? In the business world, they call it margin. I've had pastors and church leaders, well, Dave, you're marginalizing my calling. They hear that word, and I know most of them don't know. They just think it's a bad thing, and so I say, well, what is margin? What's your definition of margin? And so preachers, we always have something to say, and so they'll spin it for a while. Some of them are pretty close. And I said, listen, margin is what you have left between what it costs you to make something and sell it. What you have left is your margin. That's what you create and expand your future business with. It's margin. I said, would you like to have more margin in your community, in your city? Would you like to have more impact? Just before I came, a few days before I left on this trip, there's an attorney, a very successful attorney in Dallas, who is the president of the Mesquite School Board. It says Mesquite. I assumed it was Texas. He got it. He's a graduate of Evangel University. And they did an article on him in their latest magazine. And he said in there, and I highlighted it, I've got it in my briefcase, the two most influential positions in any community is place on the school board and a place on the city council. Boy, I highlighted that. I sent him an email. Man, you're singing my tune. But see, it should be all of our tunes. Do you want to kick the influence of the enemy out of your city? Let me finish tying the gates of your enemy to Matthew 16, verse 18. Brother Gary mentioned it again, I believe, last night or this morning. I shall build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. In the Old Testament, the gates were places of influence. If you wanted to take a city, you had to take their gates. That's why Samson carried the gates of Gaza away. Wish he'd come back and do it again. Gaza's right there next to Israel. It'd be great if Samson would show up. Excuse me. Proverbs 31, woman, your wife or your husband shall be spoken well of sitting in the gates, the places of influence. In the Old Testament, in the major cities, there were 3 sets of gates, not just one. You go into a common area, go through a second set into a common area, and into the third set, there was a common area. Guess what they were? Commerce, judicial, and education. I will build my church, and the gates, the influence of hell shall not prevail. If we possess the places of influence in our city, in our nation, wherever God has called us, you're not going to go to the community, but you're going to greatly influence and aspire and affirm and be the biggest cheerleader for your marketplace ministers. I really believe the greatest days for the fellowship are ahead. And I believe one of the major components is, as an organization, I know of no other organization where you can be a member and not be ordained. You can actually go on the application and check it off. When I shared with the executive board in February in Birmingham, they asked me to come. And I believe there was an energy around that table for this. But they asked me the question, they said, well, how big or how many members do you think and whatever? And I said, it's up to you guys. I don't pastor a church. I'm not going to step over your leadership as a pastor and try to recruit marketplace people to join the fellowship. But I believe if you want to energize your people, affirm their calling and say, I'm here for you. I'm here to make you successful. I've delivered my heart this morning. It's been an honor to do that, Brother Gary. Thank you so much.